Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we've been called back to the legislature. Mr. Speaker, we've been called back to the legislature by this tired and out-of-touch government. But they haven't brought us back to deal with the issues that matter most to Saskatchewan people: the cost of living, health care, the state of our kids' classrooms. They're not focused on what matters most to people. Instead, we see them using the notwithstanding clause to knowingly do irreparable harm to already vulnerable kids. The question is this, Mr. Speaker: how is that leadership, and whose rights are they coming after next?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Premier.
Hear, hear. Speaker, most certainly. This is a government that is investing not only in health care. Mr. Speaker, as recently as last Friday, announced an update to our mental health and addictions action plan here in the province, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of Saskatchewan residents, that we also, we're building new schools, Mr. Speaker. I've been to a number of announcements of new schools, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to invest in the very operations of our education system, Mr. Speaker, investing in more teachers, more educational assistants, and ultimately, Mr. Speaker, in a stronger education system for our children in the province. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to policy, Mr. Speaker, this government also most certainly supports parents having the opportunity to be involved in their child's school, in their child's classroom, and ultimately in their child's education, Mr. Speaker. And so the question here today, Mr. Speaker, is why do the NDP not believe that parents should be involved in their children's education?
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is spewing nonsense and has clearly lost the plot. Saskatchewan people right now are struggling with the cost of living more than any other province in the country. We have the highest rate of mortgages in arrears, and families are paying $1,608 more in utilities and taxes directly because of decisions from that government. The Premier, we see him offering no cost of living relief, only more costs, Mr. Speaker, and more division. How did this Premier become so out of touch with the realities of Saskatchewan people?
Recognize the Premier.
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the investment in our communities, which I just covered at a very high level a moment ago, Mr. Speaker, with respect to this government supporting parental inclusion in their child's education, Mr. Speaker, in their child's classroom, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that has continuously and annually invested about $2 billion or better, Mr. Speaker, in affordability measures in the province, which have been well covered on the floor of this legislature over years gone by. Measures, Mr. Speaker, I would say that first and foremost include, when you do a tax comparison, how much a family of four in this province is paying in provincial income tax and PST, Mr. Speaker, from today back to 16 years ago when we had the honour to form government, Mr. Speaker. That family of four with a household income of $50,000, they're paying $2,499 less dollars today in tax than they did in 2007. If that same family of four finds their fortunes to be $100,000 in annual household income, Mr. Speaker, they still would remain paying $2,443 less dollars each and every year, Mr. Speaker, in provincial income tax and PST than they did under the members opposite.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we recently had some by-elections in Northeast Regina, and the voters in those by-elections sent this government a clear message. He's failing on the cost of living, failing on health care, and, Mr. Speaker, he's clearly tired and out of touch. They're not listening. There's nothing new from this Premier to fix the crisis in our health care system. We see nothing to fix the chronic understaffing in our health care system, leaving ERs closed, and nothing to address the longest in Canada wait times for knee and hip surgery. Why is this Premier instead using the notwithstanding clause against kids, instead of acting now to fix what is a broken health care system?
Recognize the Premier.
Speaker, with respect to the legislation ultimately that will be introduced, Mr. Speaker, and not withstood, Mr. Speaker, that's about preserving the right for parents to be involved in their child's education, something that the NDP can now explain to parents as to why they do not support that parental inclusion in their children's education. When it comes, Mr. Speaker, to investment in health care, Mr. Speaker, unprecedented investment in health care, up to and including commitments that are on the floor of this legislature, Mr. Speaker, and across this province, Mr. Speaker. Significant investments in the most ambitious health human resource plan in the nation of Canada, Mr. Speaker, that is landing additional nurses, health professionals in each of our communities, Mr. Speaker. The incentives that are being provided to ensure that those individuals are arriving in the positions where they are most needed, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing investment in new and innovative ways to offer services to Saskatchewan residents, like urgent care centres, one being built on North Albert here in Regina, one being built in partnership with the Takakoop First Nation in Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker, offering not only urgent care but mental health care, Mr. Speaker, and addictions services, Mr. Speaker, leading to that single point of access, meeting people where they need ultimately their care, Mr. Speaker. We are doing a record number of surgeries in this province, both all publicly funded surgeries, some in our public surgery centres and some in private surgery centres, Mr. Speaker, all funded by the public, by the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. What you can look to see in the future from this government, Mr. Speaker, is more investment in healthcare capital, more investment in healthcare services, and more investment in the actual individuals, Mr. Speaker, that are offering those healthcare services in community after community across the province of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, this tired and out-of-touch government has completely lost the plot. We're seeing it right here today. They called us back to the Assembly for an emergency session to ram through a bill that takes rights away from already vulnerable kids. All while a school in Saskatoon is a gaping hole in the roof, water pouring in, and no plan or help to fix it. This is what our schools look like under this Sask party government. Why won't the minister scrap his divisive plan, get back to work on the basics, things that matter to Saskatchewan parents, which is fixing our kids' classrooms today?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that member opposite talks about listening to parents. Well, I can tell you one thing. I've heard, and members on this side of the House have heard from tens of thousands of people from across this province, parents across this province, Mr. Speaker, that want to be more involved in their child's education. And to be fair, Mr. Speaker, we've heard from people on both sides of the issue. But you know something that unites everybody who contacts us on this issue, Mr. Speaker, is they want to be more involved in their child's education. The piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, that I hope to bring forward this week, maybe even today, Mr. Speaker, that piece of legislation is all about getting parents back involved in their child's education where they belong. We know, Mr. Speaker, that a child's growth and development is best when a parent is involved, Mr. Speaker. Again, the question goes to the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. Why not debate this bill today? Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear. Of course, we want parents involved in their children's education. We know that kids do best. I know that as a parent to 3 school-age children, and I know that from being a public school teacher for a decade. Of course. But this policy has been widely criticized by parents in this province, widely and loudly. It's also been criticized by the province's advocate for children and youth. She said in her most recent report that the following on this policy, quote, this policy would likely violate the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. Why is the minister pushing ahead with a policy that the independent children's advocate says will violate human rights in Saskatchewan?
Hear, hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the member opposite for the question. Mr. Speaker, why are we pushing forward with this policy? Why are we pushing forward with this legislation, Mr. Speaker? Because, as I said, we've heard from tens of thousands of parents across this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, parents who want to be involved in their child's education. Mr. Speaker, we have an opposition. We have a leader of the opposition that one day she says parents need to be involved in their child's education, but then the next day she says only some parents should be involved in their child's education, Mr. Speaker. Again, we understand this is an important piece of legislation to people on both sides of the House, Mr. Speaker. Why not debate it today?
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Eastview.
I'll be clear again for that, Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are not going to shred the rule book so he can shred the human rights code. Mr. Speaker, he's got no answer to my question, so I'll do what a lot of teachers do. I'll give him a redo. The Children's Advocate said that following through on this policy, quote, would likely violate the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. How can the minister justify using the notwithstanding clause to violate the human rights of already vulnerable children?
You're here.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said in my previous answers, and I'm going to continue saying this in this House and outside of this House, Mr. Speaker, we have heard from tens of thousands of people who are supporting this policy, Mr. Speaker, from parents, Mr. Speaker, from educators, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in our education system, there are numerous instances where parental consent is required. To go on a field trip, Mr. Speaker, to be administered medication. We believe that these important discussions around changing a pronoun or changing a name, that should also require parental consent, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're moving forward with this piece of legislation, and I'm not going to back down just because that member asked me to. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, that minister is free to share the tens of thousands of people that he's so-called consulted with. Let's be honest, this is not the track record of this government. This is a government with the track record of not consulting with people, ramming through policies and legislation without the proper process. Why is this minister maintaining a process that he knows skirts around the normal process for developing legislation, thorough consultation with all stakeholders, school divisions, teachers, and especially public and open consultation with parents in Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, this policy and this piece of legislation was given the input of thousands of parents, Mr. Speaker, around the province, Mr. Speaker. Parents who are seeing, Mr. Speaker, policies in school divisions that explicitly excluded them from important conversations. Policies from school divisions, Mr. Speaker, that were opening the doors to wider third-party involvement around sex education and other controversial issues, Mr. Speaker. We've heard from thousands of parents, Mr. Speaker, that want to be involved, and we believe that the default position of government, Mr. Speaker, should be that parents are involved. That's why we're moving forward with this piece of legislation. I hope the NDP will allow us to debate it today. Thank you.